So thank you all for being here today. We're really happy to do kind of, I'll say, second in a series, perhaps. Angelo shared some information last spring when we first started to kind of enter into this moment of virtualness, I guess we could call it, where he shared a little bit about the science of the COVID-19 virus. So as we have progressed and as the news has come out related to the vaccines, we thought this would be a great opportunity for us all to learn a little bit more about what is the science with the vaccine? What does that mean for what we're coming up against? We know in the news, we're starting to hear about another strain, and Angelo will touch a little bit on that as well. What we'll do today is have him do his presentation, and as you listen, certainly start thinking of some questions. If you want to hold questions until we get towards the end, as the person reading the questions, that will make my life easier, and ultimately this is about me, right? Totally kidding. I'm totally kidding. I'm going to take the Matt Peterson approach and say, you know what, if I'm laughing, it's a successful joke. So we're just here to make sure that we can answer the science behind this. This is Angelo's knowledge that he brings with him from the National Institute of Health. He's been with NWTC since 2011. Thank you. And very pleased to have him teaching in the microbiology courses as well as the laboratory science technology program. And just hold those questions. If you have them at the end, we will be sure to read them, answer them. He's not a medical doctor. He's not going to necessarily answer some of those things that might be more of an interest in that sense, but he can certainly speak to the science of vaccine and help us be a bit more informed about what we are coming into. Thanks, Angelo.
Awesome. So being a scientist is amazing right now, but being a virologist is even more amazing because this is what I live and breathe every day. I also do research on viruses, and just the way this pandemic has played out has reminded me of other pandemics throughout history, especially the 1918 flu pandemic. And so I'm gonna start with some of the science of what we've been seeing, and then move on to some of the data that we've been seeing, talk about the vaccines and how vaccines actually work, and then get into some talk about the new strains. And so, yeah, that's kind of the agenda for today. So first, we had to define what a virus is, right? So a virus is a really, really, really tiny germ. It's actually the tiniest germ that we have. And so it's a very, very simple creature. And it's really hard for a virologist to define this for people because it's not really a creature because it's not alive, but it has characteristics as if it were alive. And so viruses are fairly simple. They have some proteins on the outside called spikes, and then they have some instructions on the inside. And in this case, the instructions are what we call RNA. You might have heard of DNA before as the instructions that we have. Viruses can expand on what they have. And the spike protein is going to come up a lot during this talk because the spike protein is what it uses to stick onto your cells, right? So it kind of clamps down onto your cells. The cell thinks it's food, and then it gobbles up the virus. But the whole point of the virus is to get into your cells in order to take it over. And so viruses are very, very good at tricking your cells into thinking that they are food particles and your cells readily eat them. Now, coronaviruses have been around as long as humans have. Coronaviruses are actually a very common type of viruses that cause colds, right? And so if you know about colds, we have colds every season. And if you know anything about colds, virtually everybody around the world gets colds at some times in their life. And so these viruses are very, very good at infecting humans. They are also very good at escaping immunity. This is why colds happen every season, because usually they mutate and then there's a new virus, you don't have immunity to it. And so that's kind of what we're coming up against right now when we're talking about all the questions about immunity, all the questions about the vaccine, all the questions about different strains. And so this is what we're going up against. And so if you think about it, a good treatment or a good way of preventing infection is to somehow block these spikes from attaching to your cells. And so we're going to talk about how your immune system actually achieves that in order to prevent infection with the virus. Now, of course, in the age of social media, there's a lot of misinformation that is going around, right? And you probably have heard of some comparisons to influenza, the virus that causes flu, and how this is just another version of flu, nothing that we need to worry about. And that couldn't be further from the truth, right? When we look at the death rate of seasonal flu across all ages, it's in the 0.01 to 0.83 range of deaths from flu. Now, if we look at that same sort of data for COVID-19, you can see that the death rate is somewhere on the order of 10 to 20 to even 50 times greater than what we have seen with flu in the United States. Hospitalizations are also 10 times greater than what we see with seasonal flu. And so this is the fair comparison. Flu doesn't even touch this one. This is so much worse than the flu. And when we look at the number of deaths that we have, right, I've listed some leading causes of death here in the United States, right? And so you imagine the top two: heart disease, cancer, but we also have traffic accidents, other respiratory infections, flu, suicide, all these other causes of death. And these numbers were taken a while ago when it was only, I can't believe I'm saying only, 230,000 deaths, right? That's a month and a half ago. And so as of today, in the United States, after only about 9.5 months, these are full year numbers, we are at 381,000 deaths. And for the last week, the United States of America has broken records for deaths per day every single day for the last week. If we look at the weekly causes of death in the United States, right? And again, this is a little bit dated for when we were only having 11,000 deaths per week versus heart attacks, strokes, Alzheimer's, things like that. As of yesterday, our weekly average in the United States is 23,000 people per week dying, right? So this eclipses any other cause of death at least by 2 times. And so this is a very, very serious pandemic that we're going through. And this is nothing to mess around with. This is not a hoax. This is real. These are all people who have families, who have people that have people depending on them, right? Mothers, fathers, grandparents. There are plenty of people that depend on all these people that are dying. And so we have to, as a society, know that this is a very, very serious pandemic. And we need to do what we can as a society in order to try to prevent spread. And one of the most basic public health measures that we have is masking, right? And what masking does is it lowers the probability of the virus entering your body. Now, it doesn't completely prevent it. Nothing completely prevents anything. But what we have is that if you are infected and you are sneezing or coughing or talking, in some cases, to anybody else within a certain amount of feet, right, the probability of you getting COVID is then very, very high, right? Now, if somebody has a mask, right, and they're talking to somebody who is quite infectious, the person with the mask still has a high probability of getting COVID. This is because COVID is spread by aerosolized droplets. These little tiny droplets, if you've ever seen on Discovery Channel where they have a black background and they show somebody coughing, those are the little drops that come out of your mouth when you cough or sneeze. And so you still have a fairly high likelihood of getting infected. That's because the viruses are very, very small. Now, if the person who's infected is wearing a mask, right? And you're enough feet away from them. What the mask is doing is not actually preventing the virus from getting out, it's preventing the aerosolized droplets from getting out that are carrying the virus. And so the risk of infection then goes down a whole lot. And then if both people are wearing masks, we have a very, very low likelihood of transmission. And that, of course, is going with the thought of what we call social distancing, right? That whole 6 foot number is actually not 6 feet, it's 6.5 feet or 2 meters. But we know that droplets, especially larger droplets, only spread so far when they are coming out of your face. And so this is why we want everybody to wear a mask. This is very, very serious. Now, what you also might have noticed is the amount of influenza in the United States has gone way down. We are seeing very little influenza activity, and this is because we have a lot of masking. Now, you might be going, well, why is masking working so well for influenza and not as well for COVID-19? They're both spread by respiratory droplets. They're both going to be respiratory infections. What gives? Well, it turns out that the overall size of the influenza virus was a little bit bigger than the overall size of the COVID-19. What we also have found in recent studies is that influenza per droplet only carries about, on average, 50,000 viruses per droplet. And I just looked up this number today. For COVID-19, it is 185,000 viruses per droplet. And so per droplet, you're already getting a whole lot more viruses with COVID-19 than you would get for influenza. And so that's one of the hypotheses that we see for why it's spreading, even with masking versus influenza. We are seeing a huge drop in activity. Now, once the COVID-19 enters into your body, there's a lot of things that can happen. And this is the frustrating part when it comes to science, right? Because there's this myth in society that science knows all the answers all the time. As a scientist, I admit readily that I don't know everything all the time. And my mind changes as more and more data comes in, right? We are wrong a whole lot of the times, right? Because we are always changing our view based on more data. So we allow the data to drive our thinking. And this becomes frustrating in societies because we've heard recommendations change over time. But that's to be expected in science because recommendations change as we get more data. So we, of course, follow the data. Now, the frustrating thing about this virus is that you've heard on the news that you can get this and not show any symptoms at all, or you can get this and die very quickly. And so we have such a large range of signs and symptoms that it's very, very hard to keep the spread at bay, right? Because again, you could be spreading this and not even know it, right? And that has to largely do with the amount of virus that gets into your body at once. Usually with lower amounts, you're less likely to see signs and symptoms. With greater amounts, you're more likely to see signs and symptoms. Now, when the virus enters into your body, since this is a respiratory virus, it's going to go after your lungs first, especially lung cells or other cells that contain the receptor. The receptor we know of is called ACE2 or ACE2. And the virus, what it wants to do is make more of itself. That's the whole point of being a virus. If you're a virus, all you want to do is make more of yourself in order to survive. So the virus will enter into cells that have this receptor and start replicating, making more of themselves. Now, this is why I love being a virologist. This is wild to me, right? Your single cell, right, is capable of holding millions of virus. And so I want you to think about those numbers for a second. It's really mind-boggling that you can have one cell that contains 1 million viruses, and then the cell releases all those millions, and then now you have 1 million cells that each contain 1 million viruses, and those million cells release each million virus. So you can see very quickly that the amount of virus that one has in their body could get to the hundreds of trillions fairly quickly. Now, of course, you're not without defenses, right? But this virus, the coronavirus, has an answer for that, right? Because if you think about it, if you're a virus and you want to make more of yourself, you don't want something like an immune system to get in your way, right? And so what happens over an infection, right, is your immune system gets a signal that says, hey, there's a viral infection in this body. Please send some white blood cells over to help fight this virus. And so the virus does something really, really interesting. It goes, okay, you're going to start attacking me. I'm going to cause some of these cells to release more signals to call more white blood cells. Well, you might be going, well, Angelo, that sounds counterproductive. Why would it want to recruit more white blood cells? Well, this is what we call a cytokine storm, right? The cytokines are those signaling molecules. And what happens as you keep on calling more and more and more of these cells up is that they're going to cause more and more and more inflammation, right? And so I want you to think about, as you start to have more and more and more inflammation in your lungs, guess what your lungs can no longer do anymore? Well, they can no longer function, right? And so then the immune system tries to backtrack, right? And it doesn't know who's calling it up. Is the virus calling them up, or are there more white blood cells calling up? And so what actually starts to happen is this inflammatory response in your body. And that happens really at a flip of the switch. You really go from not having a lot of signs and symptoms to almost being on your deathbed very quickly. And this is what has been surprising many doctors at hospitals of how quickly this switch goes. And so when we look at what's going on in the United States right now, here is our current amount of daily deaths, right? And I want you to think about when this first started. If we go all the way back to March, right, we had a certain amount of deaths. And then this is where we instituted a lot of shutdowns, masking, public health interventions, right? Because this is when everybody was like, oh my gosh, it's on the US shores. We have this here. We need to really have a strong public response, right? And so what we started to see is we started bending the curve, if you remember all those sayings. And over the summer months, we saw a reprieve from the amount of deaths, right? And we thought, okay, we're doing really good, right? And we should open things back up. And many states started to open back up. And what started to happen is as things started to open back up and we started moving on with our lives, right? Well, stuff started happening in the fall. This is when people go back to school, they're ending their summer vacations, and it starts to get a little bit colder. And if we know about cold viruses, right, the coronavirus is part of the cold viruses, these spread much easier when things get a little bit cooler, because that means less people are outside distance from each other and more of them become inside right next to each other. And so we started to see the spike happen a little bit, and then the holidays came, right? And lots of people during the holidays do traditions, right? Traditions such as Thanksgiving dinner, traveling to see family. And so what we started to see was this nice spike that we're in, right? And so we are currently seeing more deaths per day and per week than we did at the very beginning of this pandemic. And so what we also know, because we're tracking this, is that early on in the pandemic, we didn't have a lot of tests available. And so we had no idea very early on in the pandemic how many deaths that we had. But when we started testing people for coronavirus, when we finally got tests, we were able to start associating the amount of deaths that we were seeing with coronavirus. However, if we look at another measure of how you can start to assign deaths, turns out that the United States has a certain amount of death, right? And we're able to see the amount of deaths per month in the United States over historical time. So through 2015 through 2019, you can look at the average amount of death in the United States per day, per week, per month, right? And so what we found is this past year, if we look at the baseline, right? So 0% means no difference than the average amount of deaths per year that we've seen historically. What we started to see was before we had testing available, we started to see this huge spike in the amount of deaths. So we started having 40% more death than we have ever had in the history in the previous 4 to 5 years. And so, and then we started to see this amount go down, because remember, this is excess mortality that we're measuring, as previously we started assigning a lot of these deaths to the coronavirus. And so most likely the coronavirus was on our shores causing a lot of deaths before we had the ability to detect it. And we're able to sort of detect it like this with excess mortality. Now, what we also know, right, a little bit closer to home, right, in Wisconsin, right, we have a certain amount of deaths. And so near the beginning of this, we didn't see a lot of activity, right? And we were pretty lucky throughout the summer. Now, if you remember, at the start of this, where was it? Well, it was on the East Coast, right? And so in the spring into the summer on the East Coast, we saw places like New York City, Florida, all these places having a huge amount of activity, right? And what started to happen as the fall came is that the amount of cases and deaths moved west. New York City, Florida, all those places on the East Coast started to get things under control. And then the Midwest started to have a whole heck of a lot of activity, a whole lot of death, right? And what we're seeing now is the trajectory is going a little bit lower, right? And where has it moved? Now it's in places like California. And so this is, of course, totally predictable based on previous viral models of the United States. But this is the part that's concerning right here, right? Because notice that we had a nice spike over the holidays, and then it started to go down. And then it started going up again. And then it started going down. And then it started going up again. And then it started going down again. And then we're up, down, up, down. And so when public health officials see this, right, this kind of lopsided data, what that usually means is that there's not enough people being tested, right? And we've heard this from Wisconsin public officials already, because when not enough people get tested, we're missing a whole lot of cases and we're potentially missing death. Now, how can we say that, well, these numbers are probably an underestimate? Well, all you have to do is look at the percentage of positive cases. So notice that the percentage of positive cases when we were going through this high amount was 20 to 40%, right? Now that we have less cases, right, guess what? It still is. It's still 20 to 40%. So the amount of positivity, that's the number that we're looking at. The percentage of positivity really tells us that, okay, we should have this amount of deaths and this amount of cases. And what we're seeing is we don't have that amount of death, amount of cases. So we're probably missing a whole lot. And this is because, of course, as we go on, right, lots of people are getting what we call COVID fatigue, right? I'm pretty sure most of us on this call right now are pretty darn tired of this pandemic. We just don't want to deal with it anymore. We all have this really, really big feeling to get back to what we saw was normal, get back to our lives. And it's not just one pandemic that's happening right now, right? Of course, we have a pandemic associated with the virus, but we also have an economic pandemic going on as well, right? We have people lining up in food lines. We have people losing their jobs or not getting unemployment. Or if you're in the service industry, right, you haven't had a job in about 9 months, right? And so we have this economic thing that's going on. We also have, of course, the mental health thing, right? Humans are social creatures, even if you're introverted. And so we have this really, really big problem with mental health right now, right? People are not doing well mentally. So we have three things going on nationally, actually as a world, that are really, really affecting everybody's lives. And we're so tired of it that we are starting to do something that lots of humans do when they don't want to see or hear something, right? When we do that, we just cover our eyes, cover our ears, and we just don't deal with it anymore, right? And so lots of people aren't going in to get tested because they just don't want to know. Because if they knew, right, that means I'm missing 2 weeks of work, or I'm missing 2 weeks of school, right? And we've already blown through our savings. And so as we go through here, right, the COVID fatigue that people are seeing and feeling is really real, right? And we haven't been able to come together as a society to properly address that because, of course, there's a lot of political and societal things going on right now. But we really need to support each other through this, because if not, we're going to keep on spinning our wheels and the virus is going to win. And so what we're seeing right now, this is sort of dated right now, but this is the information that we were talking about as public health officials, what we predict would happen, right? And so if we look at transmission being established, right, we all knew that if we didn't do anything, we would have a whole lot of cases and a whole lot of death, right? And then after a certain amount of people died, right, the more people you have died, the less people you have to infect, and then it would eventually go away. And so what we wanted to do was flatten this curve, right? Because the healthcare system in the United States could only handle so many cases at once, right? And what we're seeing in California right now, and what we were seeing in New York City, was what happens when a healthcare system becomes overwhelmed, right? Then you start to see excess death go up, because notice, right, if your hospital's filled with coronavirus, you can't take any patients that are having heart attacks or meningitis or strokes, right? And so all these people are becoming these fatalities that are associated with COVID because the healthcare system is overwhelmed. And so we said if we could kind of do these public health interventions, we would be able to flatten the curve. And it wasn't to stop the coronavirus, it was simply to have it slow down enough so that our healthcare system could keep up with it. Now, if we were to be able, right, so that's this green line right here, right? So we started social distancing, we instituted all these public health measures, and if we kept on them long enough, right, we would start to see the virus not be able to transmit because you don't have enough hosts. However, and we warned about this, right? What actually happened was this blue line, right? So this blue line, we started to see cases go up, and we were all ready to do the public health interventions. We were all scared of what would happen. And so we all started masking, we all started social distancing, workplaces shut down, the country started to shut down. And of course, when we did that, we saw a reduction in cases. But again, as that COVID fatigue happened, and the society and political systems of the United States started saying, okay, well, we can't do this forever, we need to live our lives. Well, if we lifted those interventions too soon, what's going to happen? Well, the virus is just going to come back. It doesn't care about your societal view or your political view. Its goal, again, is only to infect you and make more of itself. And so, again, what we've been trying to do this whole time is buy time, right? We're trying to buy time to get a hold of this. But we haven't, as humans, done a very good job, at least in the United States. So that's why we have to talk about vaccines, right? And we in the United States have done a lot of stuff with vaccines. And so if you don't know already, vaccines are not treatments. Vaccines are not medicine. What they are preventative measures, right? And if you were ever a kid, which all of you guys were, or if you've had kids, you probably have received vaccines. And the way the vaccines work is they introduce something that looks like the germ into your body. And there's a lot of different vaccines. We're going to talk about that. But when it introduces something that looks like the germ in your body, what will happen is your body goes, oh, well, this thing's foreign. We can't have that. We need to destroy it. And so what it will make are these weapons. And these weapons are called antibodies. And antibodies are kind of like bullets. And they will go to and attach, killing or preventing the pathogen from replicating. And what will also happen, this really, really crazy thing that still amazes me. I've been a scientist for a long time. And no matter how much I repeat myself in lecture or anything like that, the human body still amazes me. That you have cells that once they make those antibodies, they're smart. They say, well, hey, that germ might enter into the body at some future point. So you know what? We're always going to keep these guys around, these antibodies, or the knowledge of how to make these antibodies for the rest of the person's life, right? Just in case you ever are exposed to it again. So I want you to think about something, right? From your first breath of life, how many things have you been exposed to until now? Probably a whole heck of a lot of things. And so you have a lot of these weapons, a lot of these antibodies that you've built up over time that should protect you from getting sick from something that's the same. And if we look at history, of course, about the effectiveness of vaccines, we've had whooping cough, right? If you've ever had a child with whooping cough, you know that this is not a normal thing. It actually kills a lot of children under the age of 2, right? Cases before the vaccine versus after the vaccine. Cases before measles. Measles used to cause a condition called panencephalitis, where your entire brain would swell and then you would die in about 0.1% of the population. Now you might not think, well, 0.1%, that doesn't seem like that big. But if you multiply that by the amount of people in the United States, that's a huge amount of people, right? And so measles cases then, measles cases now, right? And so 99% reduction over time. Same thing with mumps, rubella, diphtheria, polio. The amount of reduction that we see before and after with the advent of vaccines has been really crazy. We've been fighting pathogens as humans for a very, very long time, right? Science has been doing this for a long time. And as humans, I want you to think about this, right? This is lopsided biological warfare, right? You have trillions of viruses per person times the amount of people in the world, right? So it's trillion viruses per person versus one person, right? And somehow we've come up with the technology to make that one person stronger than a trillion of these germs that before vaccines just killed people. And so I'm hoping that you get the sense of appreciation, how crazy over the past 80 years that human ingenuity has come to kill all these things that used to kill us. Now, when we talk about vaccines, right, we've had lots of different vaccines in our lifetime. This is just a small chart of the vaccines that we have in use today. And there's a bunch of different types. There used to be what we called live vaccines. Live vaccines is where we take the germ and very, very, very tiny minute amounts inject it into you, and your immune system kills it before it has time to replicate, right? And so if you've ever, if you were born before 1972, you probably have had what we call the smallpox vaccination, where you might still have that scar on your arm with the dots around and the dot in the middle. And that was the smallpox vaccine. We eradicated that virus from planet Earth, right? The first time ever in the whole history of humans where humans were able to eradicate a virus that, get this, has almost caused humans to go extinct twice. Almost caused humans to go extinct twice, and then the world came together with a vaccination program to get rid of it. Now, there's also what we call live attenuated vaccines. Attenuated refers to the fact that we can take bacteria or viruses or whatever, and we can grow them in conditions that aren't in your body, right? So for instance, we might start growing these in cold temperatures, right? The temperature of your refrigerator. And then when we inject it into your body, well, guess what? It's used to growing in your refrigerator. So when it's in your body, right, it can't replicate. It can't cause disease because, of course, it's not used to that environment. And so we have lots of vaccines like that, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, the MMR vaccine, which is very, very quite effective. Now, in order to understand why your immune system responds to these, we have to kind of compare this to humans, right? So I want to put on my human hat for a second. I'm usually a robotic scientist. So as a human, right, most people have fears that go very, very deep inside of them. And two of those fears that are very common in humans are spiders and snakes, right? This is what a lot of people are afraid of, right? And so imagine, if you will, if I took a box full of snakes. I have 200 snakes in this box. And before I'm doing anything, I'm defanging them. So they actually can't, bite you and hurt you. But I took this box of 200 defanged snakes and put it into the room that you're sitting in right now. How would you maybe react? Yeah, snakes, spiders, whatever, something that you're really viscerally scared of. Right? Now, you probably are thinking to yourself, oh my God, I would jump on my desk. I would just start going crazy. This is what happens with your immune system when you have a live attenuated vaccine. It's like, oh my gosh, all hands on deck. We have a really, really bad pathogen thing that's alive and is replicating. Everybody, all hands on deck. Everybody go to that part of the arm that was just injected in and make sure you start fighting everything here. And that's really, really going to produce a lot of those memory cells, right? Because if I were to do that to you, you would probably remember that for the rest of your life. And so that's why your immune system has this really, really strong reaction to live vaccines. Now, there's also what we call killed vaccines or dead vaccines or inactivated vaccines, in which, say I had those 200 snakes, but I killed them before I dumped them in your room, and now you're just sitting there looking at dead snakes. You might be a little bit scared, not of snakes, of me killing 200 snakes, but you might be a little bit less scared than if they were alive. And so if you're looking at those killed snakes, you're not going to have as strong of an immune response, right? Because your immune system goes, it's dead. Well, we'll get at this, but lots of times you're going to need boosters. But the advantage with killed vaccines is that they could never, ever, ever cause disease because they're not alive. And so you might notice things on here, something like influenza. Now, of course, there's a lot of myths with vaccines. You probably heard from your brother's dad, cousin's dog, that when they got the influenza vaccine, they ended up getting influenza, which is biologically impossible because it's dead. Dead things can't cause disease. However, what we do know is that dead things can cause immune responses. And so if you think about this for a second, you want to have an immune response to a vaccine because that's the whole point of getting a vaccine. And so the most common immune response, of course, is like reddening and pain and swelling around where you were injected. Because if you think about it, you would want that to happen when anything foreign got into your body. You want to see inflammation there. That's how you tell it's working. Some people get fevers. Well, fevers are also an immune response that are going to be responsible for killing pathogens. You actually want that to happen, right? There's also what we call toxoid vaccines. Toxoid vaccines take out the entire pathogen and takes the toxin part that makes you sick and cuts it up so it doesn't make you sick. And then you introduce that to people, right? Tetanus, the tetanus shot that you get that lasts for 10 years, that's what that is. And then there's what we call cellular fraction vaccines and recombinant vaccines. These vaccines, of course, do not contain any pathogen. There's no living pathogen, there's no dead pathogen. What we do is we take a little piece of it. Take a little piece of it. right? So if you have a pencil, I would take the little eraser, right? And then anytime a pencil entered into the room and it had this eraser, it's like, oh, I recognize that eraser. It belongs to this pencil. And so it allows recognition from your immune system. Now, when we talk about vaccines, those are the kind of different types of vaccines that we have on the market. But when we're talking about COVID-19, right, we're talking about viruses. And so, again, for the viral vaccines, we've used live attenuated viruses in the past, right? We've used inactivated viruses in the past. We've used just tiny pieces of viruses in the past. But it turns out something that we haven't used a lot in the past is the instruction code of the virus. Remember, I told you that viruses are very simple, right? In the past, we've used these little spike proteins right here, or different pieces of protein, and that's it. But it turns out that since this is an RNA virus, what can happen is that since RNA is the genetic instructions for this virus, if we show your immune system the genetic instructions, then it will be able to know that, hey, if anything in here has what's encoded in this genetic instruction, we're going to attack it, right? And so when we're looking at the types of vaccines that have been tested over these past 9 months, right? There's many vaccines that we've been testing, but the ones that have been made first are what we call the RNA vaccines, right? So remember, the RNA is the instruction codes, and you don't even need the entire instruction code. All you need is a piece of the instruction code, right? And so here, different biotech companies have said, okay, here's the instruction code for that spike protein. So we're going to give it to your immune system. The immune system's going to read that instruction code and show all the other white blood cells in your body, hey, this is what you're looking for. This is the protein that you're looking for. Go get it, right? Now, there's a kicker. It turns out that inside your cells right now, you have a lot of DNA because DNA is really stable, right? Stable at your body temperature. RNA, at the other hand, is not very stable because it falls apart very, very quickly. And so what we have to do is keep it deeply frozen until we get a chance, of course, to introduce it to you, right? Because it only is stable for about 12 hours, and then it disappears. Now, we also have to have a way of introducing it into your body, right? And so we just don't put naked RNA into your body because the naked RNA would degrade, right? At 37 degrees, it would degrade very quickly. And so what we do is we surround it with lipids. Now, lipids are kind of like fats or oils, right? And if you think about your cells on the inside of your body, your cells have these things called membranes, which are fats or oils. So to understand this, you would have had to have seen a lava lamp at some point in your life, right? So I want you to imagine a lava lamp, or those things as you heat up that wax, you have these little bubbles going around. But every once in a while, when you have a bubble hitting into another bubble, the two become one, right? So if we have a lipid molecule that runs into the cell membrane, which is also made out of lipids, those will combine and introduce the RNA inside. Now, there's been a lot of talk about, okay, well, since this is genetic material, couldn't putting something else's genetic material into your body cause something to go wrong with your genetic material? Well, it turns out no, right? I want you to imagine food that you eat, right? Food comes from nature. Nature, things like lettuce or beef or anything like that, all the cells that you're eating right now has its own DNA and its own RNA, right? That you consume every day. And your food does not change your DNA. If it did, every time you ate a hamburger, you would turn into a cow. And so it's not possible to change your genetic material with RNA. Furthermore, the RNA in this virus is what we call positive strand RNA. Positive stranded RNA viruses don't even go into the nucleus. What happens is that they go to these special protein factories in your cells called ribosomes. So this doesn't even have the chance ever to interact with your DNA. And so there's no risk, if you will, of inserting RNA into your body. In fact, a lot of the vaccines that we have done actually use DNA, right? But again, a separate organism's DNA is not going to change your DNA because you have your own DNA that's evolved over hundreds of millions of years to make you as an organism, right? So that's not going to be able to change anything about your DNA. Now, also of concern, right, is what we have seen with Operation Warp Speed, right? Because if you know anything about vaccines and science, right, there's a lot of testing that goes on for the whole approval of vaccines. Because if you want to vaccinate the population, right, you want to make sure that it's safe. So the US government, in fact, all world governments have a great interest in vaccines being as safe as they can be, right? And the reason is because if vaccines aren't safe, but as a government we're requiring you to get it, if vaccines caused injury to you that were significant, right, everybody in the United States would have some sort of injury. And then you wouldn't be a tax-paying producing citizen. And so if you don't pay taxes to the government ceases to exist. So it's in the government's best interest to keep you as healthy as possible. And so what we've decided in regulatory agencies like the FDA is that you have to do all sorts of testing, right? So you have to start testing in animals to get the correct what we call antigen or the target. You have to test things that will help the immune system localize this. And then we start testing in people. And we start out with a small amount of people, right? And see how that works. And if it seems to be safe and effective, we move on to more people, right? And if that starts to be safe and effective, we move on to more people, right? And usually vaccines to get from idea to society can take between 10 and 20 years. That's on average, 10 to 20 years for vaccines. And yet, somehow we got vaccines in 6 to 9 months, right? And many people think, well, hold on, that can't possibly be safe then. Well, it turns out you have to have some historical knowledge, right? Because if you remember, the virus's name is not COVID-19. That's the name of the disease. The name of the virus is SARS, right? SARS coronavirus 2, right? And so what happens is that we actually had SARS coronavirus 1 before. So it turns out way back when we were having a SARS outbreak, which stands for severe acquired respiratory syndrome, right? That virus killed a whole lot of people, and then it all of a sudden disappeared the next year, but people already had started trying to make a vaccine for it. Now, since it went away, the government funding to continue on that vaccine went away. But now that we're seeing something that looks almost exactly like SARS coronavirus 1, we have all the animal testing from before already done, right? And so what most world governments decided to do was said, hey, we're going to make a bet, right? Because what happens here is that usually if you're a biotech company investing in making a vaccine, you're going to do this after you see some great progress here, right? So say you have 10 vaccines that you're testing in animals and only 3 make it through, right? So over here, you're going to test those 3, right? And only 1 might make it through. And so there's billions upon billions upon billions of dollars that go into all of this research, right? And biotech companies don't like spending billions upon billions upon billions of dollars if ultimately it's not going to work in testing. And so what the US government and most world governments said is, hey, I will pay for the entire vaccine studies. All of these clinical trials, everything's going to be paid for. And you can test these thousands of vaccines that we are considering. And we're making a bet that this one's going to work, or this one's going to work, or this one's going to work. And so all of them were already paid for. And so notice then, if everything's already paid for, you can test every single vaccine candidate at the exact same time, and you can start the clinical trials at the exact same time. So everything started at the same exact time, right? And then we saw a couple, right? People are going, man, some of these biotech companies got incredibly lucky, right? And that just doesn't pass the sniff test, right? How could you get so lucky? Well, it's not that they got lucky. This is out of the thousands that were invested in, these are the ones that made it through and showed the most promise, right? And so the biotech companies didn't lose money on this. And so that's what made everything faster. And so again, usually you wouldn't be going into any of these trials unless you were very, very quite successful and you weren't going to spend the money to do that. And so that's why we see such a albeit rushed, but also when they released their data, and I've read the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, they did a really great job on all the safety testing and all the efficacy testing. Now, what we don't know, which is also important to discuss, is how long does immunity last? Because remember, colds are seasonal, right? Colds are seasonal. So if the immunity to colds doesn't last very long, how do we know whether or not this immunity will last very long? Because what we're finding, right, in normal people that have had coronavirus before, we're now seeing repeated infections. And so it seems that natural immunity is not working all that well. And so, but with vaccine-induced immunity, sometimes we can up that a whole heck of a lot. But that's the thing that we're still questioning. Is there going to be long-term immunity to this, or is it going to be enough immunity to get us through this pandemic enough to control further spread? Now, when we look at the vaccines that are ready and being distributed right now, what's happening, right? We very early on heard a lot about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and that's a viral vector one, so that's actually a DNA vaccine. Now, of course, advantage with that is that since it's DNA is a stable molecule, you don't need ultra cold storage for that one, right? Which makes it a lot cheaper. But if we look at the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, right, the RNA vaccines that have to have the cold storage, they are very, very, very effective. But of course, per dose, it's much more expensive, right? And so this kind of shows how it works. We put the lipids around the RNA is delivered to your cells. The RNA will be made into those viral spike proteins, and then your immune cells will go, hey, here's what those viral spike proteins look like. Please go and attack them, right? And of course, there's more and more and more vaccines coming down the line, right? Different countries are going through their different vaccines. Russia has what they call Sputnik 5, which is a funny name for vaccines if you know the history with Russia. But that seems to be also pretty efficient. And so these are the vaccines that are available and are being distributed right now, and more are coming down the pipeline. There's about 10 more that we have in phase 3 clinical trials that are showing promise. Now, of course, we have to address the elephant in the room. Of course, we have a lot, especially in the United States, vaccine hesitation. Lots of people in the United States are really scared of vaccines because they don't know a whole lot about how vaccines work. They've heard about connections between autism and vaccines, which is totally untrue. And what public health officials are worrying about now is the effect on what we call herd immunity. Now, herd immunity is a pretty complex scientific subject that I'm going to try to really try to explain it in a way that most people will understand, right? So imagine you have a healthy population, right? That's going to be in these blue people. And you see people that are infected, right? So here we got some sick, contagious person in this population. Now, every person that person interacts with, then you can predict over time will get sick because they don't have previous immunity to that. And that's what we're currently seeing in the COVID pandemic. However, as you start to take away the amount of people that COVID can infect, naturally then, right? So these yellow people are immunized and healthy. Well, naturally then, the more and more people who are resistant to the virus, the less and less the virus can spread. And so over time, what we're trying to do, right, is that we have these contagious people in a population, but we have all these people that are immunized and are resistant to being infected. Therefore, the people who are not immunized, they're not likely to be infected because there's not a whole lot of them, right? And so we're not trying to vaccinate 100% of people, right? People are sometimes allergic to components in vaccines. We just need to vaccinate enough people to where the virus doesn't have enough hosts to replicate in. And then over time, if it can't replicate in anything, the virus goes extinct, right? And so when we look at what that number is, right, we can, different diseases have different vaccine coverage needs, right? Measles, which is the most infectious virus on planet Earth. Per sneeze with somebody with measles in a room, they would infect 18 people, right? And so for that one, the virus coverage that is needed is going to be really high, between 92 and 94%. However, for things like rubella, which is a little bit less infectious, you need less people immunized. And so when we look at what this, how easy it spreads, influenza's sometimes between 1.4 and 4. Coronavirus is between 2.5 and 5. And so it's going to be somewhere between 75 and 80% of people that need to be immunized against this in order for the virus to go away, right? And so we're trying to get that many people vaccinated. The problem is that we're running out of time, because if not enough people get vaccinated quickly enough, guess what that gives the opportunity for the virus to do? Any guesses? Yeah, it can mutate, it can change. And all that investment, all that time that we spent making those vaccines, that is wasted, and we have to start over again. And so we want to be able to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible. And this is why we're seeing different tiers of people, right? Who's most likely to get exposed? Well, healthcare workers, number one. And so we're trying to think about that. If we can't massively immunize the entire population quickly enough, we're going to get the people that are most likely to be infected first. And so, of course, we had to look at reality right now, because you've probably seen on the news about these different strains of virus, right? The most popular one right now is the one going into UK. The UK is on total lockdown right now because this one is spreading almost at twice the rate of the regular one. And so that is what's going on right now, and people are very scared of that one But Pfizer just got done testing their vaccine against this, and this one is still covered by the vaccine. Whew, that was a close call. However, there's also a South African strain that has many more changes than the UK strain. And that becomes a problem, of course. And then there's a Welsh strain. We just discovered there's 2 United States strains right now. And we're trying to take all these strains and test them against these vaccines because we're in the United States, at least, really, really far behind. We have a lot of testing going on, right, to tell whether or not you are infected, but we're not taking those samples to figure out what strain you have, right? We're just saying, okay, you're positive or negative, go in quarantine and things like that because we're really limited on resources, but we're not trying to figure out what strain people have. And so we have to really up that testing in the United States. Now, why as a scientist would I be more worried about the South African strain? Well, this is a really scientific model of the spike protein. So all this gray scribbly scrabbly stuff is the spike protein of the virus, and this is the receptor, right? And so what's happening, right, this mutation right here, these 3 mutations, the reason why the UK variant is infecting at a higher rate is because there's a mutation right where it goes on the human receptor. So it actually is more efficient at attaching to the cells, right? But the vaccine covers this one pretty well. The South African strain not only has this mutation, but it has additional mutations that help it attach even better than the UK strain. And so know that if you have the vaccine work against this one, but not as well against this one, right? Notice that the virus is going to try to, we're going to see viral mutations going in the way that make it more efficient. Right? Because if you think about that, evolutionarily, the ones that survive in nature are fitter, right? So as the virus replicates and replicates and replicates, sometimes during replication, it makes mistakes, right? And most of them are mistakes that kill the virus. But the ones that actually work better take over for infection. And so that's the current news that we're looking at. We're really, as scientists, trying to make sure that the vaccines that we have coming down the line work against this one. Now, the other thing is that the beauty with the mRNA vaccines is that all we have to do is look at what that mutation is and put it in the mRNA vaccine, and now it's covered. So we should be able to get a quick rollout. However, then you have to revaccinate the entire population. And how feasible is that? And so this is what we're really, really want to see as we're going forward. Now, that's not to say that the medical community hasn't figured stuff out as far as if you're already infected, what can we do, right? Now, of course, we all remember the hydroxychloroquine studies and how that turned out not to be an effective treatment, right? But we do have some monoclonal antibodies. Remember those antibodies that your body makes, we can take those from people who have been previously infected to try to stop the attachment of the virus to the receptor, right? And there's other things coming down the line, other medications like remdesivir that stops the virus from replicating when it gets inside of your cells. And so we have treatments that we're trying to use that have been used against other RNA viruses that will slow down the virus enough to have the immune system be able to catch up and clear it out. But again, the results are not consistent enough for us to say this treatment is what you need at this point in time. And so that's where we're at with coronavirus in the new year. Okay, and so with that, I will take any questions that you guys have. And Heidi is going to help us out with the reading of questions. I saw some questions come up in chat, but I'm really happy to take any of them right now.
Well, thank you, Angelo. I'm always impressed with your ability to take something very complex and make it easier for us to understand, not being scientists. You do this every single day in the classroom as well for our students, and you just have a very passionate way about sharing this. So thank you for all of this information. So the first question that I saw was, and I think you answered it relating to, does RNA change our DNA? And Keith asked that question, and soon after you answered it beautifully. So we're good on that one. The next question related to the impact, does the gut biome impact the severity of COVID-19?
The jury is out on that one, and we're doing a couple studies on that one, because when we look at the ACE2 receptor, we see that it's not only in the lungs, but it's also on neurons. And so this is why we're seeing people lose the ability to smell and taste, because sometimes the neurons are infected and it takes a real long time for you to regain that back. So there's a neurological aspect. There's also a muscle aspect that we're seeing. And then some people present with really bad GI problems, lots of diarrhea, things like that. So there's a whole host of things that we're just now beginning to appreciate. And even in the people that don't develop signs and symptoms when they're infectious, that does not mean that the virus isn't doing damage. What we're seeing is these previously infected people, right, who had coronavirus, didn't show any signs and symptoms, didn't even know that they were infected, are now having respiratory problems or neurological problems and things like that. And so we're seeing these people called long haulers that are showing all sorts of different signs and symptoms that the virus is no longer there, but we have these permanent signs and symptoms. And so we're still trying to measure that. The possibility of it doing something against bacteria in the gut biome is pretty small. It might change the environment of the gut that makes the biome react, but it shouldn't be long-term enough during that infection to actually have a lasting effect.
All right, thank you. Next question. How come the immune system does not overreact to the vaccine?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we can control the amount of pieces that we put in. And remember, it's the virus itself. You have to have that live, or not alive, but that active virus present, telling the cell to release the signals, right? If you just take a piece of the virus, that piece of the virus is not able to cause the release of any of those signals that cause the disease, right? So if it's just the piece of the virus, there's not enough of it to actually cause any really great immune response that we see in an actual infection.
All right. You shared quite a bit about some of those other viruses and other things where we have vaccinations, and a question came in about, does measles kill? You've shared the explanation that was really gross to think about. One person sneezing and I get 18 people infected.
Yeah, measles is not only the most infectious virus known to man, but before the vaccine, it killed a lot of people, especially children. And we still worry about that around the world today, because we're seeing outbreaks of measles. This is still endemic in some countries. And we really worried about it. I think it was in 2016 where we had that outbreak at Disneyland. So that's the thing. We don't want any of these deadly pathogens making a comeback because not enough people are being vaccinated. And we've had such success with vaccination programs in the US that many people are not old enough to remember measles and polio and tetanus and things like that. And so we're trying to educate parents again on the values of vaccines and look at the data.
Total side note, based on a lot of the conversations that we've had within the science community and talking with you, during this shutdown, one of the books I read related to the polio virus, and that was fascinating to read and understand a lot of that process. So shameless plug for reading about polio. It's a really interesting, and I know you and Kenlin have talked about books related to the 1918 flu pandemic, so probably some additional reading. Okay, another question related to, well, it's a little bit of a statement, but if you want to clarify anything to it. So basically, in a nutshell, this will never go away unless 80% of the people vaccinate.
I would say that would be a true statement.
All right. Can you lose antibodies/immunity when you donate blood following COVID?
So no, because what's being isolated is your plasma and not your cells. So if you've ever been to a place like BioLife, right, they hook you up to the machine and they take out some of your blood and then they spin it around and you get that brown stuff. That's the plasma that contains the antibodies. But then they put back your blood because your blood is what's containing the cells. So the cells are important. Now, the white blood cells that carry memory, right, don't constantly really circulate in your blood. They kind of stay in different places like your lymph nodes. There's some in your spleen. There's some in your lungs, of course, and they kind of just stay there and not circulate until there's a problem. And so once the pathogen enters and goes, oh crap, this thing's back. Everybody, here's the thing to look for. Boom. And so you don't have any risk of losing immunity through plasma donation.
Okay, thank you. Is it recommended that people who have had COVID get vaccinated?
Oh, yes. And that's also the World Health Organization's and CDC's recommendation based on what we've seen with the what we call natural infection. So natural immunity doesn't seem to be good enough. And this is, of course, predictable because cold viruses don't induce enough immunity because usually colds are mild and your immune system goes, I'm not going to deal with this one. That's not deadly enough. And so since your immune system typically recognizes this as a cold virus, you don't build up good immunity. Whereas with this vaccine, we can really, really have adjustments on the immune response. And so even if you have had a natural infection, it is not likely that you've built up enough of those memory cells to have you not be infected again.
Okay. So it sounds like that probably answers your question too, Kristen, is not enough memory cells to have built that immunity response up.
Yep.
This is a question I had as well. What is the substance in the vaccine that people are having allergic reaction to? And kind of related to that, the question I had was, is it typical that people have allergic reactions to vaccines?
Yeah, so there's this substance called polyethylene glycol, or PEG for short. And so if you remember that lipid circle around the mRNA, the lipids that help it attach to your cells, that's the substance that is in the lipids. Now, people typically are not allergic to that. However, what we've seen in the United States and other parts of the country is that this is the first time that we've used this lipid delivery system to deliver mRNA. And so what we have been realizing that, and PEG, if you've ever had yogurt before, you've eaten this substance. It's in most of our foods that we eat. Anything that has any fat-like content in it has this. And so if you've had an allergic reaction, or if every time you eat high-fat foods, or if you read the labels and it says PEG on it, it's also in shampoos and conditioners. If you are very sensitive with your shampoos and conditioners and things like that, and you can't use certain shampoos and conditioners, you may be susceptible to that. Now, when we say a lot of allergic reactions, we're not actually seeing a lot, because it turns out with the news, of course, every time there's an allergic reaction, it's all over the news. Oh my gosh, this person had a really severe allergic reaction. Over the course of the last week, we've immunized 10 million people on planet Earth, and we've seen 3 allergic reactions. So it's a 3 in 10 million chance that you might see an allergic reaction. So again, not very likely. If you're concerned, your doctor can actually test to see whether or not you're allergic to that before they vaccinate you.
So I should probably buy that lottery ticket and I'd have a better chance of winning than getting an allergic reaction.
Of course, yep.
All right, I'll go do that next. Pregnancy, is there a concern about getting vaccinated with the newness of the vaccine related to being pregnant?
So again, this is the hard part with the amount of time that we've had. Right now, we see no evidence in the people who have been pregnant in the clinical trials and those who have been vaccinated showing any problems with mom or fetus. So we haven't seen any problems. Does that mean that if we do more vaccinations that there's not going to be problems? No, but based on how vaccines work, right, there's lots of vaccines that we give people while pregnant and there's no effect. And in fact, actually the flu vaccine that we give to pregnant women actually cuts down, what we have observed is that there's about 3 times less miscarriage in moms that have been vaccinated with the flu vaccine than not. And so there's also protective mechanisms that happen.
Wow. And you now have Pam Thornton competing with you for puns. Nicely done, Pam. All right, next question. Isn't this virus just going to continue to mutate over and over again like the flu and be with us forever unless a cure is found?
So there's no such thing as a cure for a virus, unfortunately. We have antibiotics for bacteria, but it turns out that we have a great history, right? Polio mutates, right? And we've nearly eradicated that from planet Earth. Smallpox, nearly eradicated from planet Earth. So we have precedents of eliminating viruses from planet Earth. All we need is, of course, people to trust science again. Trust that over time, right? Though we've made some mistakes in science, what we have in common in science now is just this wealth of information about how the body works, how the immune system works, and we are very, very sure that if we can persuade enough of the public to be vaccinated, that we can indeed get rid of this virus, because if it doesn't have anybody to replicate in, it's going to go away. But again, it's up to all of us to do that. And that's kind of part of the public good, if you think about it. Vaccination is not just for the individual, but for the rest of the society.
After being vaccinated, would it still be recommended that if a person gets symptoms that could be a cold or cold-like, that it could be COVID?
Yeah. So that's the concern with these 2 doses, right? And so the 95% number is what the immunity is after the second dose, after 14 days, right? So as your immune system's building up immunity after the first injection, you'll have about 50-60% immunity. After the second injection, you'll still have some immunity. It's going to keep on building up over those next 2 weeks. And this is why we're recommending still get tested, still do the social distancing, and still wear the mask, because, right, numbers like 60% or even 95%, well, that still leaves the 5% where it can be infected. There's no vaccine that's 100%. But what we're trying to do is still limit the number of infections.
Okay, there was a question that I had talked with somebody yesterday about too, was masking after being vaccinated, but the potential for still having some portion or some bit of the virus, definitely continue to mask.
Correct.
Okay. If you have suffered trigeminal nerve damage as a result of COVID, will taking the vaccine help with this condition?
No, because once that damage occurs from the virus is no longer there. Now, could it prevent it from happening more from what the virus? Yeah, if you don't get infected again, right, there's not going to be a possibility of having more of that nerve damage. But once the nerve damage is done, right, unless there's something that I would have to know more about the condition, but once the nerve damage is done, usually that nerve is not going to recover that well. And so, but you don't want to get more nerve damage. And so definitely still get the vaccine. The vaccine won't help the nerve damage, but it will prevent it from getting worse in case you're not infected more.
Okay. It's difficult to understand why we need boosters for some things, but we talk about the vaccination staying in your body, waiting for an infection. What makes memory cells, and can we influence this?
Yeah, so so we're going to get into some science here. So remember that snake example that I gave? Right?
Yeah.
So remember, your different vaccines will have different immune responses, right? So those live vaccines, your immune system really freaks out and creates a whole bunch of memory cells. Versus with the dead vaccines, you don't create a whole lot of memory cells. And so what we do is we try to artificially boost the immune response with this ingredient called an adjuvant. An adjuvant is kind of like a salt. The most common one that we use is aluminum hydroxide. And what happens is a salt, right? If you think about salts like on your table, the salts actually keep the antigen, the target there in your arm for longer. This is why sometimes when you get shots, it hurts a day after, because what it's trying to do is keep a large amount of the pathogen in one place, right? Because remember that 200 snakes that are roaming around your room right now, you're really scared of that. But if I said, I dumped 200 snakes around Green Bay, you're not as scared because it's spread, right? So if you keep it concentrated, you're going to have an artificially boost response because your immune system goes, oh crap, there's 100 zillion things in the body, right? Because it can recognize it all at once. And so we can artificially boost it with some pathogens. And other pathogens, remember, your immune system has a history, right? Cold viruses typically don't do immune response because they don't really cause lots and lots of death, lots and lots of conditions, right? Whereas with measles, right, measles can swell your brain and cause your head to pop, right? Your immune system takes that one really seriously. And so it just matters what the pathogen is.
I'm going to thank you now for giving me nightmares tonight. Appreciate that about the snakes. This is just a funny question. If anyone tells me this is a hoax again, can I give them your number?
Yes. Yes. You can, I'm recording this presentation.
There you go.
So.
All right. And then thank you, Julie. You have posted several different pieces of information. So she included some information, the official statement from the American College of Obstetricians, I can sort of say that word, and gynecologists, so related to that pregnancy question. All right. Can you comment on official and personal age recommendations for getting vaccinated, specifically asking related to the lower end for kids' vaccinations?
Yeah. And so this is where there's a lot of argument at the CDC, right? Because what we have found is that kids are less likely to have severe disease. However, depending on the age group, right, anybody over, I think, the age of 8 spreads as much virus as a full-grown adult. And so we're right now trying to vaccinate the people that have the higher risk of deadly disease. But there's a few scientists at the CDC that go, well, hold on, if we vaccinated the people that are more likely to spread it, less likely to wear masks and wash hands and socially distance as much, which is our kids, right? Which is totally natural. Kids aren't used to, all the hygienic practices that adults can perform more easily. If we get rid of something that's spreading it a whole lot, can we therefore protect the people that have more severe disease? And so that's an argument that's going on at the CDC right now.
So sort of related to one a little bit later is when will teenagers to be able to get the vaccination? And I don't know if you know kind of the timeline or the phasing, but.
Yeah, so what I have is information that I get from my former colleagues at the NIH and the CDC. All of these questions that the public has, especially on this call, are all currently being discussed at the CDC. The problem is that the amount of vaccines that we have right now is not enough for the entire population. And so who do you target first and why? There's always going to be a group of scientists that go, no, I disagree with that, but you have to have majority rule in these cases to target people, and different countries are doing this differently. So again, there's lots of debate going on. Right now they have tier 1 and tier 2 figured out, but they're doing it by career type rather than, and the elderly. So career type and elderly, but they don't know who's going to be in tier 3 and tier 4 yet.
Okay, so stay tuned.
Yep.
What can we do to help anti-vaxxers understand all of this? I have friends and relatives in this category, and I often worry about the proliferation of these groups. Notice he's taking a drink first.
Yeah, so, and this bothers me for a very long time because all the education that scientists use on this is, present facts, present facts, present facts. But there was a few groups, especially at Harvard, that studied that exact question, right? And it turns out that the more facts that you present to people that are hesitant or against vaccines, the less likely they are to get a vaccine. Because what's going to happen is, and this has to do a lot with conspiracy theory, right? The more information that you try to explain to them, the more they think you're part of the conspiracy. And so what they found was that using what caused them to be anti-vaccine in the first place is an emotion. So if you use emotion in your arguments, right, it doesn't even matter the data. If you were to show a COVID patient on a ventilator and then showing the family crying next to that person's body to a person, that's going to be much more effective than numbers, because it puts a realization that, hey, this is humanized. This can be me. This can be my kid. This can be my grandparent. And using emotion is a much more effective tool than presenting the facts. Even though logically we would think that's backwards, it turns out humans are more emotional as a species than logical.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Let's see. How will we know when it is our turn to get the vaccine?
Yeah, and this is also, so a lot of public health people around the nation are wondering this question too, because we have to set up clinics, places, and there's people that have different types of mobility, right? So if you look at the underrepresented populations, they're less likely to have cars, they're less likely to, so where do you put things and how do you do this? And you have underrepresented populations being at the higher end of the death spectrum too. And so so what has been happening is that the public health has been going through workplaces for that, because people who are working with patients, right, if it's offered through your employer, the person's already there, you can offer it right there. But where the next groups are targeted is still a question that remains. You would have thought that we would have figured a lot of this stuff out right now over the last 9 months. We would eventually get a vaccine, but again, these questions are really, really hard ethical questions that can't just be decided on a whim. So that's why we're still behind on that.
Well, that is perfect timing. We are at 4:29, and we are at our time and end of questions. Matt just shared a little bit. Looks like educators have been bumped to 1B.
I just heard that, yep.
Okay, so certainly good news for NWTC, phase 1B, excuse me. Thank you for your time, Angelo. Thank you all for being here, asking the questions, being part of this, learning, and taking this back to help share with others the importance of science. Obviously, NWTC feels very strongly about this with our laboratory science technology program. We are working to develop scientists all over the place, and really appreciate everybody's time and interest.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. As soon as I get the recording, I'll try to send this out to people who are interested. I'm pretty sure that it's going to be posted somewhere too. So as soon as we have that information, we'll send it out, and feel free to share.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all for your patience and letting me speak to you. It's a great honor for me to be able to share information for people to trust me. So thanks a lot, guys.
1,000 thank yous happening. So yeah, people very much appreciate you. Thank you.